Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, to begin with, good evening.
Good evening.
Slavery established the black body at the very bottom of the American racial order. Justice Taney, in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, said, "Black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect." It's very important. Slavery, and more particularly the iconic plantation, established the black body at the bottom of the American racial order. With emancipation, black people migrated to cities both north and south. Their reputations followed them. They trickled in, became concentrated. The concentrations became ghettos, and we had the birth of the iconic ghetto. The iconic ghetto. The iconic ghetto in our day and time has become even more profound. Not only is it an important icon, it's also a very important source of stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. The black body moves about in a larger society, in a white space oftentimes, with a deficit of credibility. Not because of anything that is peculiar to the black person in terms of merit, morality, achievement, what have you. The deficit has everything to do with the fact that the black person is not white. Very important to understand. So we're dealing today with a kind of symbolic racism. In addition to the structural racism that we face every day as black people here. Today we have the biggest black middle class in American history. But so oftentimes these people of color move about with a deficit of credibility. Their work has to do with the fact that they must disabuse people of the notion that the ghetto stereotypes apply to them. So they work and work and work. And they get beyond the deficit of credibility, sometimes only to achieve provisional status. Provisional status. This is the reality. Doesn't matter what class you are, how much money you got. What matters is the color of your skin in a world that privileges white skin and denigrates black skin. This is what we're dealing with. So the things that you see on the news and social media about the police shooting black people and all that, this is what I'm talking about. But be advised, what's going on in these circumstances is not peculiar to that kind of relationship between the police and black people. Unfortunately, American institutions are in crisis. American institutions are in crisis. Before we launch into some of the meaty questions we have for this evening, I wanted to give the students a chance to get to know you both better. So, Audra, would you begin saying something about your bio?
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my personal story as a Christian, and then also my intellectual story about how I came to study race. So I grew up in a Christian family. My parents were raised nominally Christian, and when I was about 6 months old, my mother came to understand that it wasn't just important to go to church or to have a professed belief in God. She really wanted to understand what it was like to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and she came to understand that Christ had died for her and wanted to have a relationship with her. And so she committed her life to Christ at that moment, and then taught my brother and me the same things. And when we were young children, she led us to accept Christ as our Lord and Savior. I tell that story because I think everybody has to make a personal decision about following Jesus or following any type of faith tradition. You're not just born into it. They're decisions that have to be made at various points in your life. And so for me, that decision came very early in life, and it was a decision that I've recommitted to at various stages in my life as I've grown older, as I've developed and understood a little bit more about what faith is and what following Christ is. Just to lay it out on the table, I'm African American, in case you didn't notice. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, so, wonderful, yes, absolutely. So actually I'm from Henrico County, so I grew up about 10, 15 minutes away from the Confederate White House, and you'd go to doctor's appointments on Monument Avenue, so I certainly grew up seeing Confederate iconography, and it just kind of blended into the background. You just kind of get used to it after a while. Race was something that I probably tried to run away from. I didn't want to be defined by it. I was very early targeted for being smart, and so sometimes that separated me from my classmates and my peers in ways that could be helpful, but in ways that also kind of could be very damaging, not just in terms of being teased, but also in leading me to believe that I was somehow exceptional and that I was probably one of a handful of Black people who could operate and move in a space like this. And I soon became disabused of that reality. But one of the things that was actually really helpful for me as a college student was that I was intellectually interested in questions of race and African American history. And so as I started to go to school, read, take classes, my classmates and my professors started to challenge me to think about racial issues, so much so that I actually changed my career focus. So when I went to college, I had intended to become a lawyer specializing in international law. I dreamed of arguing cases before the International Court of Justice. And after taking classes in African American history and racial and ethnic politics, my professors were telling me that I should probably become a professor. And I listened and I did research work for them. And I finally came to that conclusion as well. And so that's in part how I ended up here for graduate school. And it was a wonderful time, and I see old friends from graduate school in the audience, and so it's actually really great to be back here.
And James, with your focus on law?
Sure.
Same question to you.
Okay. So first, let me say, y'all probably know this because you chose to come out tonight, but in case you were somebody who was drawn by the title of the forum or drawn by the organization that's sponsoring the forum, I just want to make sure everybody knows what intellectual treasures we have here on the stage. So Eli Anderson, Dr. Elijah Anderson, is somebody whose work has influenced me and has influenced generations of not just sociologists, his field, but anybody who thinks about questions of civil rights, questions of the Black condition, questions of relationships between police and African American communities. His work is foundational. And many of you likely know it already, but if you don't, please get to know it because you will be changed by it. And Dr. Gillespie comes in this tradition out of political science, not sociology, but her work, including her book on Cory Booker and the New Black Leadership, is something that really must be read. And she has a new book coming out. I can't speak to the new one. I've read the book about Booker, and it's a masterpiece. So I hope that y'all will make it your business to get to know these works. In terms of my own background, I guess in terms of, it's about law. I mean, so my parents met in the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1960s. They were both in an organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And my dad was the first executive secretary of SNCC, and my mom was what she used to call, she wasn't in the leadership, she was in the fellowship, is the way she described it. But she dropped out of college to join SNCC. She was a student at Sarah Lawrence, and she as the way she tells it, she just couldn't get up every day and have her world be research papers and writing when what she was seeing on television and what she was hearing about from other people that had been in the South was a level of racial injustice that she felt like needed to be confronted personally. So she left college and joined the Northern Friends of SNCC, and then eventually moved to Atlanta. I say all of that to say that in a lot of ways, my commitment to civil rights and racial justice issues through law was almost, unearned. I mean, it was something that I was born into. My parents split up when I was about 7, and we lived in New York City at the time with my mom. And after a few years, she came to me and my little brother and she said, we're gonna move to Atlanta. And if anybody here is from New York, you don't tell a kid from New York City that they're gonna move anywhere. Because if you're in New York City, you're in the center of the universe, and everywhere else is country. And Atlanta is for sure country. I mean, that's just how it is. And so, but my mom, my dad is African American, my mom is white. They raised us as black children and as black boys to be black men, and her view was that the world that she was in and the world that had come to be created for us was a world in which we weren't seeing the kind of black role models that she wanted us to see. And I know you're thinking, well, New York, there's places she could have moved to Harlem, but there's a funny way in which it's almost easier to just pick a whole nother city. And she knew Atlanta from the Civil Rights Movement. So she moved us down to Atlanta, and her point was that she wanted us to grow up opening the newspaper every day, and back then that's what people did, they opened the newspaper, and see black people in positions of authority. She did not want our only representation of black people to be degraded or downtrodden. She wanted us to see black people in positions of power, and she wanted us to go to schools with black principals and black teachers and a strong black community. And that influenced me very profoundly. So that we can keep going, I'm gonna stop now, but the one thing that I'll say that relates to then my journey into law is when I graduated from high school, as wonderful as my community was, I went to one of those high schools where if you look in the yearbook of the freshman class, and then you look at the pictures of the senior class, there's twice as many pictures in the freshman class as in the senior class. And what happened to all of those people along the way was people dropped out, people got kicked out, people got locked up, people got referred to alternative schools. And so even when I left high school, even at that stage, I knew that somehow, some way, I wanted to try to make my life's work be about the half of the kids that I knew in 8th grade, 9th grade, who didn't walk across the stage with us senior year.
Audra, in studying black leadership over the years in what has been called post-racial America, given the steady stream of racial incidents that are all across the social media, what does that term mean to you?
Nothing, and it never did. And I usually have to put this disclaimer because I have a monograph and an edited volume that have post-racial in the title, and my usual defense is my editors made me do it because it was for marketing purposes to sell books. So, people started to proclaim that America was post-racial when the Obama campaign started to gain momentum in 2008. And so I think people got really excited about the prospect of an African-American president, and breaking that glass ceiling might be evidence of the fact that American society had finally opened up. And it did open up in some ways, but there are many, many ways that we now are acutely aware of now in which it did not open up. And so we were very premature collectively as a country when we were proclaiming the nation to be post-racial. So, President Obama's success is wonderful. It is something that should be celebrated. It is symbolically important for the entire nation and particularly for African Americans. But one man's success does not necessarily mean that we have arrived racially. I mean, even before we start talking about police shootings, and I know we'll spend a lot of time talking about that today, if we look at every basic measure of socioeconomic status, so from income to wealth to life expectancy to educational attainment, all of these kinds of things, blacks are still behind whites, and this has been the case usually in roughly the same proportion for as long as anybody in this room has been alive. So, and that's not to say that there hasn't been progress, because clearly there has been progress. Otherwise, I don't think any of us could be sitting up here on this stage. But I think we lulled ourselves into sort of putting too much emphasis into the importance of the election of the first black president when we decided in South Carolina in 2008 that America was post-racial, or as they said after the South Carolina primary, that race didn't matter anymore. It still does, and I think sadly we've all had this rude awakening in the last year and a half of the ways in which it's still important.
Well, James is a lawyer whose work is focused on prisons and schools and crime. What does it mean? What does this mean to you? Where are we today as a society?
Can I just say something about South Carolina? So I was teaching at Georgetown in 2008, and I was involved with a group of students called Hoya Law for Obama. We couldn't call ourselves Georgetown Law for Obama because it was because we couldn't have the Georgetown name associated with a political campaign. So it was Hoya Law for Obama, and we all went down in the South Carolina primary, and there was a group of us that were behind the stage that group that's in the background behind the candidate when they're giving their speech. There's about 6 or 7 students and myself, and there was this, there's hours of waiting before they give the results and the candidate comes out, and people started chanting, "Race doesn't matter." The level of, and now it's like ridiculous, right? We laugh, as some of y'all started to do, but it's almost hard to capture this sense, this like moment, this like little moment of optimism, even among people who really understood that race mattered a lot. There was this moment of the idea that my father would not have been, and every black person you talk to would say the same thing. Either they'll say, "I could never imagine," or they'll say, "My father, my grandfather, my grandmother could never imagine the day." So, and now this was a group of students. They had taken critical race theory with Chuck Lawrence and Mari Matsuda. So whenever we were shouting, people were chanting, "Race doesn't matter," and then my students would say, "Except when it does. Race doesn't matter, except when it does. Race doesn't." It's one of my favorite moments from that campaign. So yeah, South Carolina and race doesn't matter. The question you asked, was obviously, was so broad, and we see it playing out. We see the way that race plays out across the legal system. It has its roots back in slavery, as you, I think, appropriately started us with, because I think the thing about slavery that people still don't comprehend is the psychic and psychological toll that it takes on a nation to organize yourself in such a way that you would hold a race of people in bondage and expose them to unending physical assaults, tear children from parents wantonly. What are the things that you have to tell yourself as a nation about those people that you are doing that to? You have to create a set of myths. And that's why I think every myth that we see today, every stereotype or every now, implicit bias that you see today about African Americans that they try to test on the implicit association test or otherwise, they're all rooted in slavery. Because you have to believe that a people are lazy to justify beating them in that way to make them work. You have to believe that they don't care about their children to justify selling children away from their parents. You have to believe that their bodies can endure physical abuse without suffering in the same way to be able to inflict that kind of abuse on them. You have to believe that they are naturally dumb in order to justify refusing to educate them. These are the things that we as a nation, that America had to tell itself for 250 years, for longer than we have not had slaves. We had slaves. So for that entire period of time, we had to tell ourselves those things as a nation about a group of people, and that doesn't go away. Those beliefs don't just vanish with an Emancipation Proclamation or the Reconstruction Amendments. So that's why it's essential, I think, that we start with slavery, enshrined in law, in the Constitution, yes, with the 3/5 clause, yes, with the Fugitive Slave Clause, yes. But also deeply embedded in our psyches in a way that I think very few of us, including black people, want to really, really come to terms with because of how painful it is to really face up to that.
Well, this is a great segue into the issue of anger. And I was struck, as probably many of you were, by the way the survivors in South Carolina of that church shooting were so ready to forgive. It's part of being Christian. To forgive Dylan Roof for the murder of those innocent people. And I would ask Audra, the anger for a lot of people was palpable, for sure. And I would ask you just to pose this question: how do you, as an African American person, how do you deal with that? What do you do? How do you deal with that anger?
Yeah, Charleston was really gripping it for me, as it was probably for many people. And I was shocked and stunned and heartened by the forgiveness of the victims' families. I had the privilege of participating in a PBS roundtable discussion in Charleston after the shooting. And so one of the things that I took away from that was I had the chance to meet victims' family members and actually people who were there at Mother Emanuel on the night of the shooting. And so one of the things that was very clear that people wanted to make, crystal clear was that not everybody had forgiven yet. And that forgiveness was a process. And so that allowed me to sort of think and reflect about what forgiveness means in this context, both as a political scientist and as a Christian. And so I was allowed to write an op-ed piece, which you can find on pbsnewshour.org, about forgiveness and what role forgiveness plays in it. So I was in New Jersey when the shooting happened, and then by the end of the week, I was in North Carolina, and I was in my hotel room, and for some strange reason, I got up on Saturday morning and I had on Fox and Friends Weekend. So it's not my usual practice, but the lead story was the forgiveness. And as a Christian, there's something very powerful about forgiveness. We're taught that because Christ forgave us, we have to forgive other people. And that if we harbor bitterness, if we refuse to forgive people, then that actually will short-circuit our relationship with God. So it's imperative upon us to forgive people. And that was evident in what the families did at that arraignment. And so I understood that. I completely respected it. And I hope, because I believe that Dylann Roof is not beyond redemption. I hope that he remembers what happened there, and I hope that God uses that to draw him back to himself, to really bring him to a place where he can repent of what he's done while he's in that jail cell for the rest of his life, because I think he's got what's coming to him with respect to that. But what really got me about watching the news was the attaboys and the pats on the back that everybody else took because of the forgiveness of that family. And that irritated me to no end. I was actually deeply offended by what I was watching. People who would likely claim to be my brothers and sisters in Christ, it was, yay, Jesus, see how superior we are. And then there's that part of during the public mourning, where people continually talked about the fact how people forgave and there was no rioting in South Carolina. So they're making class distinctions. They're acting like what happened at Mother Emanuel was the equivalent of what happened to Eric Garner or what happened to Michael Brown or what happened to Tamir Rice. There was just so much going on there that was just deeply offensive and just overlooked the other stuff. So when it comes to forgiveness, there is personal forgiveness and then there's societal forgiveness, and I think we are in different places depending on our position. And so, if somebody personally aggresses against you, I think you can use the legal system and do whatever you have to do to sort of take care of the justice end, but you're personally responsible before God for forgiving that person. That's the turning the other cheek part of it. But when things happen on a broad scale and they're well publicized and we as a society are implicated in it, we're not victims. We have a responsibility to sit and think about, well, why did this happen and what can we do to fix it? And so nobody in South Carolina, well, I don't say nobody, but it seemed like in that discussion, in the immediate aftermath, there really wasn't a deep, serious discussion about what kind of societal influences led Dylann Roof to believe that he was superior to Black people because of the color of his skin. And what led him to that trigger hair moment where he decides it's a good idea to go get a gun and decide to go up in a church and shoot Black people up. Who was teaching him the things that ended up on that website? What can we do as a society to make sure that we can prevent that type of behavior again in the future? And we didn't see that. Instead, we saw people being really self-congratulatory that Charleston didn't burn down. And it sped up the moment to remove the Confederate flag from the state capitol, which people have been arguing to do for generations. And if that's all that comes out of this is that that flag came down, I mean, I'm happy that the flag is down, but as I've said before, I've gotten very used to seeing Confederate flags in my life, so that's it. If that's all we got from that, then we didn't learn. And we're talking about how we forgive the shooter or how we're separating ourselves from Dylann Roof and just thinking that he's marginal and not really sort of figuring out how he's us. Then we haven't done our jobs and we haven't gotten to the root cause of the racial sickness that is inherent to the story of America. That was just a Band-Aid on a gangrenous wound. And so, my fear, what I mourn about what happened from Charleston is that we didn't learn enough from it, and that there will be some other incident, maybe not as heinous as this one, maybe it'll take on a very different form, where we're going to be going over the same issues again because we refuse to acknowledge the ways that racial hierarchy still persists in this country, and the ways that we are all implicated in acts like that, in ways where we shouldn't be just sort of saying, well, we forgive, and so let's move on from that.
James, one of the issues raised by the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and so many others is this intersection between conscious racism and structural racism, a part of which, as I alluded to in my introductory remarks, is symbolic racism, as it were. There's a certain portion of the American population that will be explicitly and consciously racist in their approach. But there's a real problem of structural racism where well-meaning people, just by virtue of operating within the prevailing institutions, end up supporting oppressive racist policies. How do you deal with anger you experience when you see legally supported structures of racism?
Yeah, it's hard, right? I mean, yeah, it's hard to deal with that anger. I think that, you know, I guess I would put another kind of bias or racism out on the table in addition to the two that you talked about. I guess, you know, you talked about sort of personal and then also structural, and then there's also, you know, implicit bias, which I guess is a kind of yet another category, or maybe connected to one of the first two, but, you know, this way in which, you know, there's so much research now about people's association when they, you know, if they see an African American face and they make an association to, oh, you know, this person is more criminally inclined, or this person is not going to work as hard, or this person is more likely to be a drug dealer. And, you know, our kind of assumptions about sort of who people are, you know, based on the color of their skin. I mean, there's a house a couple blocks away from my house that I walk past every morning to school. I take my son to our neighborhood elementary school, and we walk by this house, and there's always these groups of guys that are standing out behind the house. They're like, I don't know, 18, 19, 20, 21. They don't bother anybody. They're just kind of standing around, smoking cigarettes, white guys. And I remember asking another parent, we were walking, and she was like, do you know who those people are? And I said, I don't know, because it was like a new house. You know, this group just moved in this house. I said, I don't know. And she says, oh, I wonder if it's like a college fraternity or something. And I remember thinking, like, okay, like, that's an interesting, like, assumption to make about what this would be. So it turns out that what this house is it's a step down, a drug treatment addiction program. So basically, if you go to some other parents did some research, were just telling me about this. Basically, if you go to like Choate or Deerfield or somewhere else, and you have money, and you get kicked out of a prep school because of like too much drug use and addiction, which I didn't go to a prep school, but my friends that did say that like you have to have a lot of drug use to get kicked out of a prep school for too much drug use. But if you do, then, and you have resources, then this is the kind of place that you go to. So, and this is so important, and it's so connected to your point about, you know, the ghetto and the iconic ghetto. These guys get to walk around in public space without any association of being drug dealers or addicts. Now, And I want them to have that liberty. I don't think that people should be subject to stigma based on drug use or drug sales, for that matter. But we have a drug treatment, quote unquote, we have a place for people who don't have money, who use or sell drugs, a mile away from where I live, which is right over here, and it's the Whaley Avenue Jail. And I work there. Now, so if you're poor, and given other factors that we talked about, then disproportionately African American in New Haven. So if you're poor and black, then where you go for this problem is the Whaley Avenue Jail. And if you're wealthy, and I'll just say wealthy because I think if you were upper middle class African American, you could get into this spot as well, although all the people there were white. That's where you go. You go to a really, I mean, it's a beautiful house. It's right on Whitney. I mean, it looks like a grand East Rock mansion. That fact is a manifestation of the biases, the implicit biases, and the structural racism that we've been talking about. And it makes me angry. I have to control it because I'm taking my son to school. But then on the way home, after I've dropped him off, I can be mad.
Christianity and law in America both have a mixed history when it comes to questions of race. On the one hand, many church leaders and self-professed Christians were part of the machine of racism and felt no tension between their Christian beliefs and their ownership of slaves or oppression of African Americans. On the other hand, the civil rights movement in America followed the abolitionist movement in Britain by being strongly religiously motivated, by being a strongly religiously motivated movement led by convinced Christians who saw their campaign for justice as inextricably linked to their faith in Jesus. Likewise, law has been a huge factor, both in supporting and undoing racist systems. Audra, where are we now in terms of religion's role in promoting or undoing racism?
Well, I believe that Jesus is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, but as my mother says, he has bad PR. With respect to race in the church, I've been in church and heard people question President Obama's citizenship, heard people make snide comments about social welfare policy with their designer clothes on. I kind of been like, shut up, really don't want to listen to this. So, as a church, particularly in the American church, we have a long way to go. And so when I think about this from a spiritual standpoint, sin is our attempt to do what we want to do when we want, how we want, sometimes to try to achieve good things, but to do it in our own strength. And so I think Christians, like anybody else in this country, are often motivated by their own self-interest, motivated by their own sense of sort of cultural superiority. And if they don't surrender that to Christ, then it manifests itself in ways that are actually really ugly. And that's sort of at the root of all sin. So if we think about greed and arrogance and all of those kinds of things, those are often also wrapped up in racism as well. And so what I see sometimes in the church is that people have not surrendered that aspect of their lives. What's actually probably more damaging and more troubling, and this is something, and I'm preaching to myself sometimes, when you are confronted with the Bible telling you that there's no respect of persons, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, that we like to figure out a way to take our culture or our self-interest and rationalize it as being spiritual in some way. And we do that for lots of things in our lives. So I could take out racism and fill in the blank with some other ways that we do this. And it manifests itself. It manifests itself in consumerism here in the United States. There probably is a reason why prosperity gospel sort of, really took root here. And some of my friends, I think of Marla Frederick at Harvard, who can talk about reasons why African Americans might be drawn to it, but it takes root here because we have a tendency in this country to try to take our culture and then put the little patina of Jesus on it and say that it's okay. And we've done that with race too, and we still do it. And we're going to have to do the hard work, sometimes the slow work, and certainly the painful work of disabusing ourselves of that and laying bare before Christ and allowing God to tell us about ourselves and to submit. And so, when I think about the scripture where Jesus says, if any man come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. What that means is that you're going to get told you're wrong about some stuff. You're going to get told that there are certain things that you can't do, that your motives are wrong. And if you're really going to have that vibrant relationship, that intimate relationship with God, you're either going to submit on that stuff or you're going to double down on my own self-interest. And then when you do that, that's how we end up with all of these isms. So.
James, same question for you. How today is the law used or misused in relation to racist systems?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that, so one concern that I have with law is, so let me say something about legal education, so kind of law school, which is that I feel that one of the problems with how we train lawyers, and I think therefore a problem with law, because how we train lawyers then has an impact on the law that is created by those lawyers as lawyers and judges and advocates and policymakers. One of the problems is that we don't have enough conversations like this one. This, what I see every year is 200 new law students come to this place. And I saw it at the other schools that I taught at as well. And they come with dreams and passions and a heart connection to why they are here. They come full of the memories of the people who struggled in many cases, sacrificed, worked 2 and 3 jobs in some cases to get them here. And then they arrive and we organize our operations as to strip all of that away and to kind of educate them in, I think, an unduly narrow way that is overly focused on this thing we call thinking like a lawyer. Well, the greatest lawyers, the lawyers that have mobilized for change, are not people that lost touch with their values. They're not people that lost a connection to the deeper life questions that we're trying to wrestle with here. When I think of somebody like Bryan Stevenson, he is one of the nation's greatest lawyers and greatest civil rights lawyers in our history because of that deep heart and soul connection that he feels to a history, to a tradition of struggle, perhaps to a religious community, but whether it's officially religious or not, it's deep and it's spiritual. And so I think we need more of this if we're to make law be an instrument of change as opposed to an instrument of stasis and inequality.
Andra, what resources do you see in the Christian faith for overcoming or transcending racial and socioeconomic differences? And why have those resources not been more effectively leveraged up to this point? When most people in America, especially most African Americans, would identify on some level as Christians.
Well, I mean, I think the reason why Christians haven't been effective in dealing with race is because we're disobedient, and we've just allowed ourselves to wallow in disobedience. And if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to get past that. And that's going to require repentance. That's going to require actually like looking in the mirror and taking a real hard stock about what's there and about what we're doing that's wrong. And people don't want to do that. People get very, very defensive, and it manifests itself in conversations where people don't want to confront structural inequality at all. If you point it out, people will sit and argue with you about why you're wrong. I have a story, and I don't know if the student was Christian or not, but it's the attitude that I want to talk about. And there are Christians who have this attitude. I teach African American politics, so within the first 2 weeks of class, we talk about the reasons why blacks would have a completely different worldview born out of their experience. And so we talk about certain differences. So one of the differences I'll point out are wealth inequalities. And so I can point out income inequalities where we'll see that blacks make far less than whites do dollar per dollar. And then if we point out wealth inequalities and look at median wealth, we could see how, it was 1/6 before the crash, and it plummeted to 1/20th and 1/18th for blacks and Latinos after the stock market crash. And I had a student literally raise his hand in class and be like, "You made that up." And then in my evaluation later that semester say, "She plays with data," like in order to convey a point. And it's that type of attitude that I'm unteachable, don't really want to consider sort of alternative points of view, that usually lends to there being impasses. And those attitudes are prevalent outside of the church, and they're prevalent inside of the church. And so what that suggests is that there's a certain hard-heartedness, there's a certain lack of humility, there's a certain arrogance that God calls sin in any form, and it's just manifesting itself here. So on a spiritual standpoint, what needs to change there is grace. And a lot of us think about grace as unmerited favor and mercy, but in the Greek, grace is really God getting on the inside of you and changing you and really empowering you to become what he intended you to be in the first place. And that would require us to give up control, and we don't like to give up control. That's why we sin. That's why humanity is in such a fallen state. So we're going to have to do that and then figure out the ways to apply that to this particular issue. And so I think the breakthrough comes when people can actually sit down and have honest conversations with one another, where people are being humble, where people are sitting and listening, particularly people who come from privileged backgrounds. And people are privileged on many different dimensions, so I'm not just singling out certain people in this room, but where people can get past their privilege and actually listen to other people's stories, to listen to different historical points of view, to take in different data, and to understand what people are talking about. Because there are sometimes in this academic struggle where you are sitting and you're making certain points, and people will literally sit and argue with you about facts, so we don't even have a common ground on which to talk about certain things. We're going to have to get past that. Structurally, I wondered the extent to which in Christian communities, even when people are well-meaning and well-intentioned, whether or not people actually know the historical context, the social context, the economic context. And so that leads them to do things that are insensitive, even if they're in fact well-intentioned. And we're going to have to get past that, and we're going to have to start training people to do better and to know more before they start entering discussions half-cocked, demanding to be in charge and trying to make change that's actually, not sustainable or actually not even appropriate or welcomed.
James, what initiatives in law are being taken these days to address various forms of systemic racism What roadblocks do these initiatives face?
Well, I think probably where some of the most, I think, kind of activity that you see right now within the legal system is an area that folks in the room are familiar with because it's gotten more and more media attention and otherwise, but I think that the sort of mobilization against the having the history's largest penal system, the largest criminal justice system in the history of any democracy, is with all that then comes with that. Because it's not just the prisons, but it's everything related to and around that, from probation to parole to policing to collateral consequences to can't get a job to can't get into public housing to can't get a loan to go to graduate school. So all of that, I think, is an area that right now is a moment of momentum. It's a moment, and with sort of African American leadership at the grassroots, from the Black Lives Matter movement to intellectually, whether it's, people like yourself that have been working on it for many decades, to more recently, on this campus, people like Veshla Weaver, to African American intellectuals in the public sphere, from, Ta-Nehisi Coates to Brian Stevenson to Michelle Alexander to Khalil Muhammad. This is a deeply African American led and influenced both intellectual movement and political movement. I don't think we should lose sight of that. So in terms of roadblocks, for me, the biggest roadblock right now to that movement, well, there's many, but one is, I think, that we have unfortunately, including led by President Obama, have this focus on what we call nonviolent drug offenders. And nonviolent drug offenders are the people who we've now decided might deserve a second chance, might deserve mercy, might deserve an opportunity to return home earlier. President Obama, in his speech to the NAACP, went over and over out of his way to say, I'm talking about nonviolent drug offenders. And then in the press conference the next day, he said, I don't have much sympathy for folks who commit a violent crime. That is a profound mistake. It's a moral failing to take that position, because the same socioeconomic and cultural factors, the same oppression that lead somebody to decide that they're going to commit what we're calling now a nonviolent drug crime, are also the same things that would cause somebody to commit a crime that we're now calling a violent crime and is outside the scope of our care and concern. It's also a problem because it's not going to solve it's not going to get us down from being the world's largest jailer. Advocates have contributed to this, have sort of sold this myth that if we got the nonviolent drug offenders out of prison, that somehow we would solve our prison crisis. It's not true. We could take every nonviolent drug offender out of America's prisons today, every single one, snap our fingers, we would have the largest prison system in the world still. So please understand that. It doesn't mean that the war on drugs is not worth fighting. It is. But it just means that you can't stop there. So, and it's also, I think, a moral error and a moral failing because of the message it sends to anybody right now who's sitting behind bars. We've told you, if you're there for anything other than a nonviolent drug crime, you're not in any different position than you were before this movement to bring mercy into the criminal justice system began. You are stuck there. You are the other. You might as well be buried under the prison for the rest of your life. And we cannot say that and call ourselves racial justice advocates, and we cannot say that and call ourselves, I think, moral people.
We'll take the liberty of raising another question. Follow up. And see, I think that with, this is kind of a rhetorical question really, but with so many black people in jail, in prison, and defined as dangerous and hostile and criminal and all of that, not to mention people living in the ghetto, there's a sense in which there's an implication that black people are this way, you see. And so as black people move about in the larger society, especially the white space, as it were, undoubtedly the deficit of credibility is visited upon those people until they can prove they're not criminal, that they're not dangerous, that they're not immoral. See, this is what we're dealing with. The ghetto itself becomes a status-defining place, you see. And it dogs all black people, especially those black people who move about in the white space, you see. Andra, James, racism is older than American and seems to be able to morph from one form into another through the centuries. On a personal level, how do you keep from just giving up, trying to change it? How do you keep on, as it were?
Well, I think that there are a couple of things. One, there is progress to be made. So if at the beginning it sounded like I said inequality had never kind of hadn't improved, there are some measures on which it hasn't, and there's definitely progress. There are plenty of problems in 2015. They are not the problems of 1965. And so on the whole, we, are better off. And so I guess I agree with Martin Luther King and President Obama that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice. So that gives me hope. I also think my faith gives me a perspective about things. So when I think about Jesus and the fact that he knowingly came here to die for people who didn't always care about him or what he had to say, he also came with, he wasn't jaundiced towards people. He was coming to save sinners. And so he had a certain expectation that people were going to be flawed, and he loved them anyway. That was why he came here. And so if Christ could do that for me, knowing how flawed I am, then that gives me the opportunity and the space to love people, and then to also not be disappointed when people screw up. And to understand that that's going to happen. It doesn't excuse it. It doesn't mean that I won't fight against it. Doesn't mean that I don't have the responsibility to use my voice to call people out on those kinds of things. But there are also places where I expect failure. I expect that there may be some contention. And so I don't get disappointed, and that might actually end up being protective for me. In many ways. It's also helpful to remember, and I don't always remember in my life, that I'm not fighting this battle alone. That's part of what the faith is about, is that Christ fights for me, through me, with me. So that it helps me to sustain myself, and it helps me to maintain a sense of optimism. I also think that, especially when it comes for rights, I would love to be able to change everybody's mind about everything, but realistically speaking, that's not going to happen. And so my goal in terms of using my scholarship for justice work is to not, and I think there are people who do this far better than I do in terms of being explicitly justice focused in their work, but for my work, I will change the minds of the people who are actually in a place where their minds are willing to be molded and changed in that way. I know that there are some people who are never
going to change their minds because of anything I do or say, and God bless them. I still have a responsibility to love them, but I'm not going to get discouraged because somebody chose to be calcified in their ignorance when I can look at people who do care and who are willing to learn and who are willing to engage in dialogue. And so I just focus on that.
James?
Yeah, I think for me, the kind of the will to carry on is more historically rooted. So I've been thinking a lot about this in the past year or 2 years because so many of my students have come to me in such pain, and one of my jobs and one of the things that I treasure about being a professor is the role that I can try to play in talking to them. And so I've often thought about in this regard, I've thought about a conversation I had with my father. So I was in law school when there was really the first brutal police beating that was caught on tape. And this was Rodney King in Los Angeles. And I was a third year here when it happened. And I had already known that I wanted to do something in the criminal justice system. I was thinking death penalty, and I eventually became a public defender. And when this happened, it immobilized me. Like I actually couldn't, I basically dropped out of school for a number of days or almost a week. I just couldn't, the notion that I would walk back into this hallway and sit in the room with the same professor who was exhibiting no understanding that this had just happened or the pain that it might have, the toll that it was taking, and talk about some abstract thing. I mean, it felt useless to me. And I went and I talked to my dad. And my dad had been beaten by the police himself in the 1950s when he was a student at USC. He wrote about it in his memoir, and it was a story that he talked about a lot. And as we do with our parents, I was kind of using him to express some of the rage that I was feeling because it was safe to do that. And I was telling him in a way that I normally never would, that it was pointless, and why had he been telling us that we could make this difference, and really what was the use of the civil rights movement anyway? I mean, if he was beaten like that in 1950 something, and now Rodney King was happening in 1992, what had changed in the same city, in LA? And the normal move that he would make at that time was what you said, Dr. Gillespie, in terms of talking about what has changed, and pointing out to me all the areas. That was his normal, and it was a good response. It was a true response. But this day when I was talking to him, he didn't do that. This day, he said to me that I must have been misunderstanding him all these years, because he said that he had not given his life to the movement. He hadn't been jailed and beaten by Mississippi racist sheriffs for decades, because he thought that he was going to change America in a year or in a decade or even in his lifetime or even in my lifetime. He said, no. We're fighting for tomorrow, and we're fighting for 10,000 years from tomorrow. And that idea that we're fighting for 10,000 years from tomorrow is really at the root of what kept him going, this idea of the struggle, the meaning in the struggle because of the struggle. And so for me, I often will tell myself look at how things have changed. That's my number one go-to when I get down. But on days when that doesn't work, like that day in Charleston, that day when I have to go deeper, I go to that conversation with my dad. I go to the memory, and he's passed now, but the memory of the idea of him fighting for 10,000 years from tomorrow.
There's a question as to how these incidents reverberate through the black community. Not just the Charleston shooting, but something going as far back as Rodney King.
Yeah.
My mother lives in LA. And after the Rodney King incident, I visited her. I said, "Mom, let me use your car." "Okay, be careful. I don't want no Rodney King." You see. In other words, I was at risk. And she felt that intensely. And there's a sense in which when we see Eric Garner, when we see Michael Brown, when we see a lot of these killings that go on, there's a sense in which people internalize that.
Yes.
Black people, young black people,
Yes.
and become wary, become nervous, identify, become angry. Then what do you do with the anger, you say? Again, that's just rhetorical. Andra, you want to speak to the same question?
So, I mean, in terms of how you deal with the anger, first of all, I think it's okay to be angry. The Bible says be angry and sin not. So there's a way to just figure out how to channel your anger in a way that's productive and that's not self-destructive. So if you're angry, I think you have a right to be angry. One of the things that helps from a practical standpoint in terms of dealing with that is to put this into historical context. And I think that that's what has been so jarring about the last year and a half, especially for millennials, because I think many people kind of believed that race didn't matter in 2008. And then all of a sudden now, race matters to them in ways that they hadn't bargained on. And we're a little bit older, so we knew race mattered all along. There was stuff we had seen or stuff that our parents had heard. And so the farther I think we get away from the second phase of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where for people this is really a distant memory. And this is stuff that their grandparents went through and it's not quite accessible to them. I think it's harder for them to grasp that what has happened to them is not new to American society, and that there is definitely something to be gained from the experiences of other people. And so whether you gain it from talking to people who lived through those situations or by making sure that you're properly educated about what happened, it at least gives you some context that people have lived through this before and then lived to tell the story. We know not everybody made it through, but the testimonies of those who didn't necessarily make it through are also there to be a lesson, to be a comfort, to be encouragement to people. I think it's also important for people to have the space to be able to do this in community. On my own campus, when some students talked about racial incidents that happened to them, I heard students make comments like they really didn't know who to talk to, so they would kind of go on Twitter, and they were asking the wrong people, in my opinion, about how to interpret these situations. And so, it's a shame if they don't realize sort of who the community is for them to go talk to put things into context. When people are on campuses where they're not necessarily critical masses of minority students, where people don't feel comfortable talking to professors who will be sympathetic, whatever their race are, but particularly faculty of color, to help them process those experiences. You guys have an amazing privilege of being in a space where there are places where you can go, where there are people who are designated to talk to you about these issues and to help you process them. So we take advantage of what's here, and where it's not there, when you are in positions of power, and you will soon be in positions of power, you go to Yale. Anytime they talk about people in the news, they always put your college name in your year of graduation by the left. So, I don't even have to look at the YDN. I know Ben Carson's college and graduation year right there, John Kerry's. Take advantage of that and make sure you create those spaces where people can kind of sit and talk. Because the reality of it is that I go through stuff from a racialized standpoint
on my job. And there are people I can go talk to about this who understand, who've gone through similar situations, can provide advice and can provide support. And I'm not quite sure that we have the same level of social capital right now. And I think that's part of the reason why I think the last year and a half in particular has been really jarring for many people. It has really exposed the lack of social capital.
I mean, there's a sense in which both of you are change agents, you see. And there's always the question, how can you keep from giving up, you know? There's always that question. Where does the hope come in, you see? Andra and James, it's easy for us to say that we want to see these changes at the systemic level. But is there anything people in this room tonight can do or could do to be a part of the change they want to see?
Well, I'll start. Like it or not, y'all are the man, so actually you are in charge of the system, or you soon will be. And so keep that in mind, that this isn't just idle chatter and talk for you guys. You guys have privilege, and you're going to be called upon. You could either use that privilege for your own good, or you could use it for the betterment of other people. So it would be a question of, well, how do we think about this? I think part of it is just being mindful of how privilege exercises itself. So if you can walk into certain spaces around town and get treated better than other people, then you need to bring other people along and point that out to make sure that people get treated equitably. It could even be, in simple stuff like, especially for somebody like me who's coming from a minority group who's not always used to being in positions of power. I've been in positions where people have created Black organizations in an attempt to try to integrate systems. And when they get into positions of power, they do the exact same things as people did who were oppressing them before. And I was like, we weren't trying to break into the old boys club to be the old boys. We were trying to smash this thing up. So remember that. You're supposed to smash the thing up. Like, what those folks were doing was wrong. You were not trying to join in their madness. You're supposed to change it. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. And if it involves having people be accountable to one another, for you to get called on the fact that you're acting the same way that everybody else did and it wasn't right when they did it and it's no more right when you do it, then so be it. I think it's also just being mindful of the little ways in which structure matters and in which structure is not always pointed out as a plausible explanation for why certain things are wrong, so that then we can consider fixing it. So, I just wanted to ask as a show of hands, how many of you heard about the study that came out of Princeton? It was widely publicized in the past couple of days about how mortality rates among 25 to 50-year-old whites are increasing. Have you heard this, sir? So, okay. And it was actually really interesting to watch the sort of narrative and the report about the study. Oh my gosh, white people are dying more. It's like Black people and Latino people and Native American people have been dying for years and nobody seemed to care. So the fact that we're all up in arms because white people are dying, it's not. I don't want white people to die. I just want to be very I love white people, but the fact that we seem to be more alarmed about this than we have about high mortality rates in minority communities is troubling. And it was funny, I was watching the news last night, listening to a story where people were trying to explain this higher incidence of mortality has a lot to do with substance abuse, and it has a lot to do with structural issues like people lost their jobs, and they might be self-medicating through this, drug and alcohol use. So I was like, wow, all of a sudden this is a structural issue to deal with white mortality, but when we point this stuff out in Black communities, it's Black people's fault. I was like, well, there's something wrong with this narrative. I'm sure the people who were having this discussion were well-meaning, but this was a messed up conversation where systemic stuff is okay when we're talking about white people, but it's not okay when we're talking about Black people. We're gonna have to call people out on that and sort of call people on their hypocrisy about that and not practice that type of hypocrisy. And then I just think on a personal level, we all have biases. And so sometimes we aren't aware of them, but sometimes they manifest themselves through examples. It could be through art, it could be through literature, or it could be through personal conversations. I think we have to be receptive to people pointing out those biases so that we don't act on them in a way that actually hurts other people and gives us unfair advantage compared to others.
This is the last question to you both. James, where do you see the hope? Where do you see the hope? Where Where do you see the hope? It's a heavy issue.
I wanted to answer that
Where do you
last
see the
question
hope?
about what it is that people can do.
Well, let's stop. Let's go there, and we'll come back to this.
I think that one thing that folks can do is, I feel like especially in this moment when, I mean, as somebody who's worked on issues of mass incarceration and police aggression and disparities in the criminal justice system for really my whole career, I'm so thrilled that that is now part of the national conversation. But there's well, I talked about the nonviolent thing earlier, but the only kind of other thing that bothers me about it is there's a way in which that conversation is so easy for people to put outside of themselves. So people can say, well, yes, I don't like that, the police shouldn't be doing that, or the judges shouldn't be doing that, or the criminal justice system shouldn't be doing that. And I think that, and this is connected to what you were just saying, I think that we also have to not lose sight of what our own role is, and what are the ways in which we are implicated in ongoing racial justice or racial injustice. I think about this a lot. Here we are on the Yale campus, and I look at my own faculty here at the law school. And when I was a student over 25 years ago, we had 3 African American professors on the faculty. And Yale Law School is the school that prides itself on producing, its graduates are those that go and become law professors. So we've now been producing graduates for 25 years, since I graduated. And today, in 2015, Yale Law School has exactly the same number of African Americans on its faculty as it did in 1990. And that's intolerable. And so if I have a colleague that wants to talk about police brutality, I'm like, yes, I'm for sure want to talk about that. Oh, by the way, let's also talk about our own systems and the places we can control directly, not just ask the police department to fix their systems and leave ours untouched. I think about it every day. Here I am on the Yale campus. I walk by, I live in a city, New Haven, Connecticut, that has some of the nation's highest African American unemployment. And I walk down Prospect Street every morning to Yale Law School. And on the way, I pass an enormous construction site where they're building 2 new residential colleges. And there's hundreds of construction workers in good jobs building that dormitory. And there is hardly a black face to be seen on the construction site. And I want to say, if Yale wants to make an investment in New Haven, or if people on Yale want to talk about what they can do about racial injustice, I want to say, well, what about our own hiring practices? There's nobody in New Haven. There's nobody right over here, 3 blocks here. There's nobody that could work on the construction site. Really? Nobody? And so those are the kinds of things that it's so easy to just turn, to not even see, to just walk on and walk on. And what I would ask everybody to do is to look at your own life, to look at the institutions that you can control. Where are the places where you can have direct influence? What are the organizations that you belong to? The employer that you may be able to control, or maybe that you are. Maybe you are the employer. And ask yourself, what can I do directly in my life to advance racial justice. So bring it close to home.
Very powerful statement, because what you're saying is true not just with respect to that construction site, but in restaurant after restaurant. I go to restaurants and I see all white people serving me.
Yeah.
All white people. And it's not just that, but institution after institution after institution. That's segregation. And this is not peculiar to New Haven.
No. But it's bad here.
All over the country. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I want to raise this last question, although I think we've covered so much, really. You know, when you see so much of these, so many of these problems, it's so easy to see them as intractable. You know, I mean, as you say, you go by that construction site. I've been by there. I've seen the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen the same thing.
Your department is right up the block.
Right. And I walk around Yale's campus, and there's a sense in which a lot of black people see this as a white space, as it were. See? And so all these issues, you can feel hopeless. You can feel that this problem is intractable. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that? How do you keep on keeping on when you see that again and again all over the place? You see? It's almost a rhetorical question. I think we've kind of spoken to this, really. So I think maybe we should begin to take, if you want to take that, take it. But if you don't, we can move on. And
Yeah, no, I'm ready to turn it over to John.
I think, well, first of all, this was an absolutely extraordinary conversation. So would you please... So I recognize that it is now 5 after 9, and some of you may need to be leaving. I'm going to take the liberty to take about 10 extra minutes to ask some questions. But if you need to leave, please don't leave without filling out your card. And the rest of you can stay put for maybe about 10 more minutes while we ask our speakers a couple more questions. So to both, very quickly, at Yale in the last few days, many black students have said they're exhausted with educating white students about their experience. Will that ever change?
No.
Probably not. There's certain things. What I would love to tell black students is you don't have to bear the burden of being the representative of all black people on your shoulders. So feel free to not have to answer every question all of the time. And what I would encourage other people to do is to also take it upon themselves to not necessarily be lazy in their learning. So not ask a minority, sort of, you can take some agency. You go to a world-class school. There are classes you can take, books you can read on your own, so that you can take the time to learn things. And to be able, when you ask questions, to ask them in a way that's respectful and empowering. But, one of the things that I think some of my own students struggle with on my campus is when you feel that you're doing racial justice, you've got to cover everything. That's the beauty of having lots of people with lots of different interests and talents and stuff. You can specialize, and so I guarantee you don't have to be a member of every minority student organization or issue. There are plenty, even on a campus where, that could be more diverse, there are plenty of people to go around and cover everything. So, you do have to sort of pace yourself a little bit and make sure that you have boundaries and that you know how to say no to certain things.
And also, and I really do believe the answer is no. In that, in other words, I think you're exactly right that other folks And we're talking about this in the kind of race lens, but you could apply it in other dimensions, right? If you are the kind of the outsider to that group that's oppressed at that moment, then you have to take it on yourself to educate yourself. But it's true that if you are that group, it's not going to end. I mean, we see this, on the faculty level. I mean, black faculty, faculty of color, women faculty, women of color are always disproportionately on committees, and we take on these responsibilities because we feel an obligation to advance some of these issues, but it takes a hit on your scholarship if you're serving on yet that extra committee. And so the question so the only other piece of advice that I would give is, after recognizing that it isn't going to change, is also know that though you step forward and you step back, and we work and you have to work as a team. So that's why you do have to work in community. I was just emailing one of my colleagues about some issue around diversity, and my colleague was like, I'm tired. I am so tired. I'm glad, and we're grown, right? We're like in our 40s. We're like, I'm tired. And I emailed my colleague back and said, yeah, I get it. I'm on this now. And you take a break, because that's what we do. We take turns, and you rest up, and then you'll get back in it. And my colleague will. And so that's the other thing. We have to be there for each other and be willing to my colleague needed to take the break at that moment. So you got to also know that when that time comes for you and you need to step back, you need to finish your paper, you need to study for that exam, give yourself that liberty to step back, do what you need to do, because the fight will be there and it needs you rested and ready.
So I have to apologize to all of you who sent in some tremendously thoughtful questions. In the interest of your time and in your time, I'm going to ask you guys one more question. So the last question, what's one short thing you'd like to leave with the audience? Professor Forman, if you'd like to go first. You have one thing to leave them. What would it be?
I would say love, and I say that because I feel like love is not a concept that we talk enough about in law school. And I don't think it's something we talk enough about even in the university setting. When I started this alternative school for kids in the juvenile justice system, one of the things that we talked a lot about in our founding days and on our first year was that we wanted to create an atmosphere that was grounded in a place of love. And school administrators don't talk about love that really any more than lawyers do. But that's what we were motivated. That's what had brought us to the work. And so I think it was essential for us to keep talking about that emotion, what it meant, and the way that it could guide our work going forward. So I would ask that we not stop talking about love.
And this might be directed toward the Christians in the room, but when it talks about through us come rivers of living water, that's sort of this notion that we're not doing this alone. We're definitely not doing it on our strength. Because if we do it in our own strength, we are going to get tired, and we're going to fall short, and we're not going to achieve our goals. So I think, a big takeaway is to do. This is not an excuse. Faith without works is dead. So I'm not saying not to be active, but to be active in a smart way, knowing that God has paved the way before us, that God has given us the tools to be able to embark on this quest for justice in a way that's meaningful, and that God in the end is the one that is going to do the work and do the work through us if we avail ourselves of that opportunity.
Thank you very much. And if you guys would join me in giving thanks once again.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.